Okay, so picture a classroom. You know the scene. There's always that one student, right? The one staring out the window, doodling, just seems completely tuned out. And the easy label we all jump to is, oh, they're inattentive or they're just distracted. But what if that's not the real story? What if we're looking at this whole thing completely backward? What if the reason that student seems lost isn't because they're not trying to focus, but because their brain is, quite literally, full? Not full of long-term facts, but full of the immediate stuff they need just to follow along with the lesson. Today, we're going to unpack the science that suggests for so many struggling learners, the real bottleneck isn't their focus. It's an overloaded mind. So to really get to the bottom of why some students have such a hard time, we first need to pop the hood and look at the cognitive machinery they're working with. There's this one system that's absolutely crucial for, well, pretty much everything we do in a classroom. It's called working memory. The best way to think about it is like your brain's mental countertop. It's the space where you put down all the ingredients you need right now to follow a recipe. But just like a real countertop, that space is limited. You can only hold and juggle a few pieces of information at once before things start getting messy and, falling off. And according to this really famous model by scientists Baddeley and Hitch, this mental workspace isn't just one single thing. You can think of it more like a team. First, you've got the central executive. That's the CEO, the boss who directs your attention and calls the shots. Then the CEO has a couple of key specialists, the phonological loop, which is basically an inner ear that replays sounds and words, and the visuospatial sketchpad, which is like an inner eye for visualizing things. And finally, you have the episodic buffer, which is the integrator that helps tie all this stuff together into one coherent thought. So what happens when this absolutely critical mental workspace just gets totally overwhelmed? Well, this is where we start to see a direct link to learning difficulties. And you might be surprised at just how common this really is. The problem is pretty significant. I mean, just look at this number. One 2018 study found that an estimated 10% of school children in India have a specific learning disability, or SLD. So this isn't some rare fringe issue. It's a major challenge happening in classrooms all over the world. And so often, at the very heart of that challenge is a working memory that's just pushed past its limit. This quote right here, from some really important research by Alawe and Gathercole, just nails the problem. It highlights this huge misunderstanding. Think about it. A child who can't hold a 3-step instruction in their head long enough to actually do it looks exactly like a child who isn't paying attention. The outward behavior is identical, but the reason for it is completely different. And studies that have actually watched kids in the classroom show us exactly what this working memory overload looks like. It's the kid who gets told, okay, take out your book, turn to page 52, and answer the odd-numbered questions, but only remembers that first step. It's losing their place halfway through reading a sentence, or giving up on a math problem because the numbers they were juggling in their head just vanished. And what's really fascinating is what a 2005 study by Alawe and her colleagues found. They tested students with special educational needs and discovered that not all parts of working memory were struggling equally. If you look at this data, you can see that their inner ear, the part for just repeating words, the phonological loop, it's pretty close to average. But the systems for management and visual stuff, the CEO and the inner eye, that's where the scores are significantly lower. That's where the real strain is. And there's another layer to this. Other research shows that many students with learning disabilities also tend to have what's called a field-dependent cognitive style. In simple terms, this means they have a really hard time pulling a specific detail out from a busy, complex background. It's like they see the whole forest, but they can't easily spot the individual trees. This just makes it even harder to isolate the key piece of information a teacher is sharing, which puts even more pressure on their already taxed working memory. Okay, so if the core issue is this fragile, easily overloaded memory system, how in the world do we help? Well, the answer is kind of surprising. It might even feel a little bit backward. It's not about making learning easier. It's about making it more active. This quote from a really recent 2023 study, it captures a very common and, well-meaning idea. We tend to think that kids who are struggling should be protected from the stress of things like tests and quizzes. Our instinct is to shield them from that pressure to perform. And because of that, we often lean on restudy methods. Just having them passively reread their notes or listen to the lesson again. But the alternative is something called retrieval practice, actively trying to pull information out of your own memory, kind of like taking a low-stakes quiz. So for these students, which one actually works better? Well, the results from that experiment are pretty incredible. Just look at this. For students at a special needs school, the group that only restudied the information remembered about 55% of it later on. But get this, the group that first tried to retrieve the information, they recalled 66%. That simple act of trying to remember, even if they struggled, made the memory itself stronger. This shows us something absolutely critical.
Forcing the brain to actively go in and dig for information is one of the most powerful ways to build a memory. It's not about the stress of a high-stakes graded test. It's about the cognitive workout you get from the simple act of recall. This testing effect, as it's called, is a super robust tool that's been shown to work for all kinds of people. So all of this brings us to a new, totally evidence-based toolkit for helping every student learn, but especially those students whose main battle is with an overloaded working memory. The biggest takeaway here isn't that these students just need to pay more attention or try harder. That's like telling someone with that tiny countertop we talked about to just stack their ingredients higher and hope for the best. It's not going to work. Instead, once we understand the cognitive reason for the struggle, we can change the recipe. We can use strategies that actually work with the brain's design. So what does this new toolkit look like in the real world? Well, first, it starts with a huge shift in our perspective. When we see what looks like inattention, our first thought should be, wait, could this be memory overload? From there, it's all about using frequent, low-stakes quizzes as actual learning tools, not just for judgment. This means we have to shift our focus away from passive rereading and towards active recall, and then give immediate helpful feedback so we make sure the right information is what actually sticks. Ultimately, when you understand that the act of retrieval itself is a powerful learning event, it lets you reframe this entire conversation. We can finally move away from thinking about tests as these scary moments of pure judgment and start seeing them for what they can be, one of the very best opportunities to learn that we have. So it leaves us with a really powerful question. How can we transform every test from a moment of judgment into an opportunity for learning?